Stop.
So this conversation is literally, at least on my end, almost 2 years in the making. In October, you probably don't remember this, but in October of 2019, I DM'd you. I sent you this, basically a Reader's Digest length story of, hey, I'm noticing some stuff here, and I am on a complete intellectual island. I have no one to talk to about it, but it seems like there's an emergent religion, a religious phenomenon happening here, and there's this facts don't care about your feelings crowd that, and there's this kind of thing that it feels like we don't have the right toolkit right now for dealing with this. And actually this was not long after Dave Rubin launched his locals. And my first big post that I had on there that got a lot of traction was about how facts don't care about your feelings. This is a ridiculous slogan for this specific thing, because they're just going to say, well, my feelings don't care about your facts. Mm-hmm. And it felt like we were answering questions that were asked in Chinese and Mandarin, but we're answering them in Spanish, just totally different thing. And it's because there's this religious nature of it. And I've heard you talk a lot about it. And I was reaching out to you. I'm like, I feel like you're seeing this too. Like, what is going on here? And more of the last few years, or since then, obviously that was 2 years ago, but I've heard you would talk about the religious nature. I call it far left orthodoxy for reasons. It's got this rigid orthodoxical aspect to it. So I was just wondering if we could start there with just how you've seen the religious side of this both emerge and evolve, and how that impacts and engages with the way you specifically are trying to tackle this thing. Like just one specific example, what you and Pete Boghossian, amazing book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. And I think I even asked you about that maybe during like a Q&A somewhere, about it seems like some of these strategies aren't really the right thing for what we're dealing with. And you said that you guys actually wanted to change the book while you were writing it to kind of adapt it to that reality. So yeah, how has that impacted, whether it seems like even a long time ago you think about that, how has that impacted just the way that you're dealing with this?
I mean, it's really interesting because I kind of started out thinking of it as a religion. Believe it or not, way back when I was involved in the new atheism movement. And in 2013 and 14, Peter and I actually started talking on the phone. I remember I started having these observations, and we were already working together, but writing together, but we hadn't communicated this to one another yet. And so has this event with Penn Jillette, the magician and skeptic or whatever, and he's trying to tell Penn Jillette that, like, he says gender studies in specific, he said it works like a religion, and I think that the scholarly literature in that discipline works like their scripture, works like their Bible. And so what does that mean? Well, the correct terminology in the psychology of religion for this is that it's called intratextuality. It's a form of fundamentalism where everything that you understand is within the text. So why is the Bible true? Because the Bible says it's true, for example. That kind of, it's a form of fundamentalism. It is, in fact, usually in the psychology of religion, taken as the definition of fundamentalism is intratextuality. So everything is to be answered within the text. And so what Pete's argument is that they put out these propositions that may or may not, as he likes to phrase it, be tethered to reality. And then when you say, how do you know that? When you get to the epistemological aspect of the question, they say, well, there's this paper that says, whether it's Doing Gender from 1987, whether it's, Gender Trouble, the book from 1990 or whatever, they point in those gender studies. So they point to this body of literature, but he said that he didn't think that the body of literature was built on reality. Like it's a sandcastle. Right. Mm-hmm. And so Penn Jillette is like, I just can't comprehend what you're talking about, more or less, just completely like, no, it's not the same thing. It's not a religious scripture. That's scholarship, blah, blah, blah. And so Pete, very dismayed after the event, called me and said, dude, I'm losing my mind. Like, nobody gets this. Tell me if I'm crazy. And he tells me the same thing. He's like, do you think it works that way? And I was like, it's funny you say that. I'm actually kind of like partly writing a book about that, like right now. So the book I wrote, Everybody's Wrong About God, it came out in 2015, was kind of the culmination of two different lines of argument that I was making. One of which was that we should be moving away from the idea of atheism, because atheism itself was taking on, through things like the Atheism Plus movement, various like doctrines, religious doctrines, and behaving in a religious manner. and that this was the wrong way to think about that. And then secondly, that I think that we misunderstand fundamentally what's meant by God. And then when you put those two, I finally realized, thinking about this exact problem within the new atheism movement, that it was behaving very religiously. I realized, oh, well, you know, I was reading Aquinas one day, and it was like, blah, 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 the 5 proofs, you know, and it's blah, 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 this all men call God is how they all end. And I was like, oh, so atheism plus stands for atheism plus social justice. That's, they explicitly said that's what it is. And so it's like social justice, this all men call God, would be the Aquinian argument. And I was like, oh shit, that's what's going on here. And so I was working on figuring that out from a psychology of religion perspective. So Pete calls me and he's like, dude, I swear it's like, it's a religion, it's blah, blah, blah. And, you know, talking about the scripture thing. And I'm like, yeah, that's a huge piece. We had this really wild conversation where it's like the two of us were like the only 2 people on the planet apparently thinking this at the time. And we found each other. And it's like, you know, and so we've been thinking about the whole thing in the religious terms for a very long time. I mean, the night the infamous dog park paper got accepted, when the dog park paper was actually being accepted by the journal, we were doing an event, and this was in February of 2018, is intersectionality of religion at Portland State University. And so, you know, we've been talking about that for a very long time. Peter and I had written an article tying its fundamental Augustinian construct, the original sin construct, to this. We had written a privilege as an original sin article like a couple of years before that. Like, I think it was before Trump. So it was like 2015, we were writing that privilege operates like original sin. And then I refined that and said, actually, privilege operates in this faith more like the concept in Calvinism of depravity, that it's more the want to sin and the inability to realize that sin is bad. And sin being kind of like meaning working for your own advantage, operating in your own self-interest, and not caring what you do to you know, others as a result of that. And so it was like, wow. And so we're really working out kind of the Augustinian angle on that, you know, 6 years ago. And so for me, it's the only really comprehensible way to understand what's going on. I don't know, people get squeamish around the word religion, I think, because, you know, I think at the event we had in Tampa, I think I talked about there being good religions and bad religions. And this is what I talked about on Rogan: religions that look up and religions that look down. A religion that looks up keeps its eyes on God and it's aware of sin, but because its eyes are focused on the divine, it's working toward goodness. Religions that look down are focused on sin. So you're thinking like the kind of toxic manifestations of Puritanism. They're focused on sin and they kind of forget about the divine because they're so focused on sin. And then what do you have? Witch hunts and stuff. And so it was like, you know, this is a religion that looks down. And now I actually identify it with Gnosticism. So it's probably more accurate to call it a Gnostic cult. I'm actually referring to it now by the term scientific Gnosticism. I think all of the communistic things are scientific Gnosticism. Now, of course, wokeness itself is pretty anti-science. So it's weird because it's adopted that postmodern view of science. So now it's really more like postmodern scientific Gnosticism or postmodern Gnosticism. But it's a Gnostic cult. It has a religious aspect to it. People have heard me talk, and they can listen to my podcast. We don't have to beat it to death here about the Hegelian aspect of its metaphysics, where you kind of have this process becoming, you know, the world is becoming and man within the world is becoming, and as one to realize the absolute through a process of dialectic. And that process, you know, what you can do with Hegel, it was that, you know, the idea, the absolute is the idea. And so that's like the father, and that gives birth to the natural world, and its natural world and its expression is the state. And so the state becomes the son. And then that gives rise to a cultural milieu or a socially contingent frame, as the postmodernists might have it. That's the Geist, the spirit of the time. And then that spirit, whether it's the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, whether it's the Weltgeist, the world spirit, and how that's actually moving in a more metaphysical sense, that then becomes the arena in which the next round of contradictions in the dialectic are being worked out. That reinforms the idea to a higher level. And so you have this spiraling through history. So history now has a telos. History becomes the stand-in for God, and its process in the world becomes a dialectical process of meeting things with its negative thinking, as it's often called, or negative, or critique, as it's sometimes also called. And negative thinking, as Marcuse tells us later, necessarily becomes positive. I was just reading One Dimensional Man the other day, his big book from 1964. And he's talking about how he's talking about art, and he's talking about how you can't, it's like, he's talking about art and absence. So this all, is like presaging Derrida with his concepts of absence. And he's talking about how the absence haunts that which is not there, is haunting that which is there. And so you can tell what Marcuse is talking about is that communism is the thing, that the perfected ideal utopia is the absence of all of the systemic oppressions in the world. And that's haunting the world that we're in. And that's the energy that motivates this new way of thinking. And so this is all very religious thinking. This is all very metaphysical. This is all based at, like I said, it has a metaphysics. We could talk about how it has an eschatology, that there's the right side and wrong side of history. And when you get there, there's the stages of history, and we finally get to whether it's in capitalism, or whether it's in economic and material conditions, that's Marxism. You have capitalism arising, that's kind of the liberal stand, and then that doesn't produce equal outcomes. So now you need a managed socialism that will eventually work out the contradictions to get to the utopian communism here on earth, heaven on earth. If it's critical race theory, you have colorblind equality, but that's not producing equal outcomes. So now you need a managed state of equity, which is the equivalent of socialism, that will eventually lead us into racial justice. And racial justice becomes the proxy for race communism. And you can hear, like, once you understand this, it's very clear that this is how they actually work. And once you understand that it's all tied back into this kind of Hegelian, which is just one species of it's modern Gnostic thinking. It's thinking, it's the same Gnostic cults with the demiurgos making the world. They call them systems now and superstructures. But you have this taken out of the pre-modern context of religion and faith and parasitizing off of like Christianity to say that, Jesus was just pointing us in the direction, blah, 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 all the Gnostic stuff. But now they've taken it out of that pre-modern mythological context and locked it into a modern scientific context. Well, scientific, and then created scientism out of it. Marx called it scientific socialism, that only socialist man could understand. This went on to become critical consciousness, who understand the critical theory. These are two-dimensional characters rather than the one-dimensional man that Marcuse is talking about. And now we have the woke, who have awakened to this racial kaleidoscopic consciousness that takes in all the power dynamics. So you now have kind of like pagan gods, but they're power dynamics, right? Racism is like Zeus. And now you have like sexism is like Poseidon, and they rule over the different dimensions of life. And it all kind of gets tied back into this master narrative of the becoming of the world, the becoming, the awakening of the absolute, and the ending of all oppression, which is, again, like I said, this Gnostic idea. And I didn't say this part yet, but the heart of the Gnostic idea is that human beings have been flung into an imperfect world. And it's our job to perfect that world and ourselves within it, as opposed to God created the world and saw it as good, or for the agnostic or atheist out there, the world is what it is. Let's try to accord with the order of the world, whether it's by science or whether it's through theology. Let's try to, goodness is according with the world. Whereas in this inverted religion, it's that the world itself is the problem. The world itself is corrupt. And if we can make the world accord to us, then we've done the good thing. And if you're moving that along, you're on the right side of history, the moral judge of history and its long trail at the end. The people who live in the communist utopia will look back and judge us from their perfect moral standpoint and tell us who was right and who was wrong. It's so religious that it, I think, has to be thought of as religious. When you see how it behaves, I know at the Tampa workshop, I had a whole lecture dedicated to the point that it just seeks to raise critical consciousness. It just seeks to awaken consciousness to that this is the way the world works. Well, that's Gnosticism. Consciousness is just special knowledge of the absolute working of the world. And so it's like I think it's actually incorrect to think of it as any other way than to think of it as religion that happens to call itself theory, because that's what a religion that arose within the modern context. And I mean that in the formal philosophical sense, like post medieval and pre-postmodern. That stretch of time is the modern context that sees the world scientifically, and we're going to have this whole kind of thing. That is the only way to properly understand what this is. And of course, I also see it as I've referred to it as the holy grail of the so-called counter movement, is getting Supreme Court level jurisprudence to recognize that this is a faith, and as such, it should be protected, People should have every right to practice this faith, to believe this faith, to accept this faith, to see the world this way. I fully believe that America is big enough and strong enough to accept a, Gnostic, upside down, inverted, anti-positive, anti-human, or whatever you want to call it, faith, if such a thing wants to be. However, it must also be completely separated from the state. The state can't be a state ideology. It can't be part and parcel of our school systems. It can't be part and parcel of our military or our federal apparatus or whatever. So all this equity crap that's coming from the White House, all this critical race theory in our schools and queer theory in our schools, all of these things fall under this umbrella and absolutely need to be seen as, some people have come up with, in this period of the world stretching back 300 years or 200 years or whatever, a wackadoodle faith. And that wackadoodle faith has no more claim on the public sphere than other faiths, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, whatever. Even if you had like state atheism, no, that's not what we have in a secular country. We have, the state isn't saying you have to be a-religious. They're saying, we're not going to tell you what to do religiously. And it's a completely different thing. So I think that that's the kind of holy grail to solve the problem also, is to understand this thing for what it is, both on the level of jurisprudence and on the level of the individual. Because if you understand it as a faith, then you understand that you're being a person who lives in a secular world and understands the value of secularism to protecting faith. You immediately understand, oh, well, you're entitled to your beliefs, but I am also entitled to mine, and you don't have any standing by which to morally browbeat me. Like if your average Christian gets morally browbeat by a Muslim, like you're not in accordance with the will of Allah, they just shrug their shoulders and like, okay, good for you, and vice versa. And that's what the heart of a secular society is about. It's not that nobody can be a Christian and nobody can be a Muslim or whatever. It's that nobody's under any obligation to believe any of the other ones. And everybody kind of I think everybody in the United States at this point, or most people in the United States at this point, not everybody, have a pretty strong intuition in that direction. So once this thing gets identified as a faith, you have both the cultural argument and the institutional argument happening in rapid succession to end the scourge. And it's the same scourge as any other theocracy would be.
Yep. Yeah. So there's a lot there.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
Actually. No, don't apologize.
I geeked out.
So yeah, exactly. So you just drew a lot of lines and kind of made a flow chart here of just the way these ideas work and connect to each other. Flow, far left orthodoxy. There you go. Flow. So let's taper that off, that line, try to put a fine point on it, and like think about this. So I had this thought, two kind of parallel thoughts a little bit while I was in Tampa and then afterwards. And so you mentioned, so this race Marxism, critical race theory is race Marxism, right? But there's lots of different like other applications of Marxism, right? So we see this with like climate Marxism, you know, what I would call COVID Marxism,
Sure. Gender Marxism.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Tons of them.
And so while I was in, like, there's so many applications. So while I was in Tampa, there was this thought that just kept coming into my head as the news. I'm seeing all these news articles that are scaring the hell out of me. And it actually, part of like that thought, I started working on the plane here. I started working on like a statement of faith for far left Orthodox. Churches have these statements of faith about we believe and stuff about original sin and stuff. And the way that I framed it was like, we believe, about race is the greatest, or racism is the greatest threat to mankind. Therefore, give us power. We believe climate change is the greatest threat facing mankind right now. Therefore, give us power. We believe COVID-19 is the greatest threat facing mankind right now. Therefore, give us power. And so I'm thinking about all these different routes to power. Those different applications of kind of that Marxism, which we could maybe use as a proxy for just give us power, authoritarianism. Whatever word like nice fancy rhetoric they might use to justify it. It all culminates in give us power. Like that's the punchline. And while I was in Tampa and I'm seeing all this stuff about these articles, I think I sent you a few of them of, NBC talking about it's the unvaccinated, not the normal people. And it's us regular people are not the problem. It's the unvaccinated, and how like literal articles endorsing resentment towards
Mm-hmm.
people who aren't vaccinated. I saw an article on Huffington Post yesterday, which is, of course, a very great um, news source. And they're talking about, what do you do if you're one of the good people who participated and did your part? How can you keep yourself sane and protect your mental health? And one of their suggestions was have vax only get-togethers. They literally say don't associate with the unvaccinated, and it was that governor of Alabama who said, go blame them and they're letting us down and all this stuff. And while I was in Tampa, while I'm learning all this stuff, my mind shifted to, I am not sure that CRT is the most pressing, like immediate threat in our face right now.
That's right.
It feels like it's this. And the thought that kept popping into my head, I was awake almost all night. One of the nights I was there because I just couldn't get this thought out of my head was religions with fundamentally incompatible worldviews, doctrines, whatever, they can coexist in the same physical space. They can, unless one of them is either officially or unofficially, whichever one it is, has a mandate of hostility towards the others. And I just kept thinking about Northern Ireland, Protestant Catholics, and church bombs, and Sunnis and Shiites, where, in the case of Northern Ireland, Catholics, Protestants, that was more of an unofficial mandate. Sunnis and Shiites, a lot of them see it more as an official mandate, especially just think about how they treat like Jews, for example. And I made a post on my locals where I said, they are forming a new tenet. Like, I don't know if you know much about, like, there's a few branches of Christianity. I think Jehovah's Witnesses is one of them, where the Bible is a living document to them. They're just updating it, as they see fit. And I think, like, this far left orthodoxy, they're updating their tenets. And it seemed like they were in the process of a first draft of a tenet of mandated hostility towards the outgroup. And I had that thought there, and it's been in the front of my mind. I'm up here painting. I made a video on my locals last night, did a live stream where I was like, I feel like we're fucked. And I was looking at how all of these gatekeeping institutions of accepted knowledge and credentialing were all mandating this for their employees: Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, universities, Google, Facebook, like on and on and on. And so I guess my question for you is, so if we agree that this is an emergent religious phenomenon, and, it clearly has an eschatology, it has an orthodoxy, it has, its own internal logic in a lot of ways. Do you see, like, I know CRT is your thing, so I'm not crapping on that, and I still think it's incredibly important too, but in terms of the different flow charts to give us power, gender, race, whatever, and climate. And then I think we could add this COVID thing, right? Mm-hmm. It feels like that line, if we were just tracking it, I don't know if you've seen like those graphs, like on the Data is Beautiful Twitter or on Reddit, where it's like tracking like things. It felt like that line of the COVID give us power shot way up ahead in the last 2 weeks, maybe 2.5 weeks. And it feels like the masks have become like the kippah, like a burqa type. It's a religious symbol for them. So how do you, whenever you're seeing that stuff happening and you're conceptualizing this as a religion, like one, I guess, I even put a note here. I'm like, what is the question? Because I tend to just dump stuff on people and don't really have a question. But so, like, do you see that? Are you seeing that? And how are you, like, incorporating like the COVID stuff and just this power, this other application of Marxist Gnosticism? Like, the COVID stuff is a great example of Gnosticism, right?
Oh yeah.
Either the vaccines work, but they don't. And masks work, but they don't. If you're vaccinated, you should still wear 2 masks. People are getting it who have it, but also it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Like, so much that it's obvious. Gnosticism is just faith. So how are you, like, incorporating that into your thinking of this? Are you keeping it still compartmentalized from the critical stuff, or is it shaping? Like, how do you feel about that with this moment and just all this other stuff that you've been working on?
I mean, since January, I've been publicly speaking repeatedly and saying that critical race theory is maybe 10% of our problem. So this is something I've been thinking about for a very long time. Critical race theory is, as I've been also phrasing it, and I have a podcast about this, I've done like 3 public talks about this, is the lockpick to open Western civilization because of the enormous sensitivity that we had toward race. But COVID, because of the enormous sensitivity that all human beings have toward infectious disease, has been a very effective tool as well. And what these are called in general are mass lines of action in Marxist application. They're called mass lines of action. And the way that this thing works is that you have the underlying religious structure, then they have, as you just named, like 5 or 6 and whatever, held up your hand, all these different they have more than that, lines of action. And they basically pursue as much activity as they can down the most fruitful 1 or 2 at a time that they can concentrate on. And the second that stops bearing fruit, they just pivot to another one. So COVID was bearing massive fruit, and then the BLM thing came in, so race became actually more effective. So they pivoted to that one because of a natural circumstance that arose. They pivoted to race, rode the race horse as hard as they could. The second critical race theory started to get under threat. COVID starts becoming the big thing, but they've also tried to pivot to climate change 2 or 3 times. Every time the COVID narrative gets weak, they try to pivot to climate change. And if climate change doesn't work, all of a sudden we have another race emergency. And the problem that they're in right now, and this is why I'm less convinced that we're fucked than I've been in a very long time, is that every time they try a narrative pivot, it doesn't work. So they have to keep going back to something. Like their mass lines have hit dead ends. Like they try to dredge up the race thing again, and they meet this massive amount of just being made fun of. They try to pivot to COVID, and people are putting memes with Indiana Jones. They try to switch to climate change from COVID, and Indiana Jones is now not doing the thing. What is that? And Raiders of the Lost Ark at the beginning with the big rock. He's not taking the idol off of the stand. He's been switching it for a bag of sand. He's switching the COVID virus out for climate change and the world with the word climate change. Like people are just making fun of their narrative pivots now. They see the narrative pivot in real time. And then, you had the shooter of the Asian prostitute massage parlors or whatever, and they tried to ramp up the race narrative, and everybody was like, nope. And then, they try to do all these different, campaigns around race now, and people are like, nope. And they're like, we're not teaching critical race theory in schools. And people are like, yes, you are. And it's just like, their mass lines of action are not nearly as effective as they were before, which for me signals that they're more likely to start trying to take very desperate measures to actually flex the power that they have. Because so far, the power they've been flexing is soft power. They're using, it's not persuasion, it's coercion, but it's the fact that they hold all these institutions. So it's like with the schools. Oh, well, critical race theory isn't being taught, but it's good that it is. And even if you don't think it's good that it is, we're going to do it anyway because we have institutional power. So they're just kind of forcing it that way. But if all that, like if you're having mama bears showing up, they have to start doing stuff like locking people outside in like thunderstorms and high temperatures or whatever the discomfort is. They have to start turning off microphones. And then the problem is when the more force they use, the more obvious it is that they're using force. And I actually think that this is likely, the COVID narrative is not sticking very well this time either. Like, I think that they're going to attempt all kinds of things that a lot of people are going to reject. And this is why I keep saying everything is a category 5 or 4 or 3 or whatever I designate it, red pill hurricane. The new one that I'm calling a red pill hurricane right now, and it's a low category, but it could become it could very rapidly intensify, if you will, is the fact that they on social media are trying to suppress the argument that vaccine passports are systemically racist. Now, of course, I argue against the concept of systemic racism. I don't think systemic thinking is a good way to think about it. They are, in fact, institutionally racist, which is a real thing. I think institutional racism is actual thing. When you start passing institutional policies that have not just racially disparate outcomes, but they literally ignore some very obvious fact that produces racially disparate outcomes, or they intentionally introduce racism. By their own definition, though, which is a systemic view, or even their definition of institutional racism, vaccine passports are going to have dramatically racially disparate impacts that impact Black communities and Latino communities primarily more than anybody else in that order. And they're just going to do it. And so, you point out, hey, by your own definition, and then what does Twitter do? Is like they start striking that, people start making the memes, they start pointing it out, start making fun of it, and immediately Twitter starts banning accounts for having shared the memes, saying that it's false COVID information as their justification, which it isn't false COVID information. It's something completely, it doesn't even talk about COVID at all. Like, it's not talking about like any of the secret drugs you're not allowed to mention that rhyme with this or that or whatever,
Ivermectin.
Yeah. Apple pectin or whatever, yeah. It's like Javerjectin, it's like, they're not it's not anything to do with the normal stuff. And so now it's like, oh, they're just literally, they don't care about systemic racism in their own definition, or institutional racism as it actually might be, at all. They actually don't care about it. And B, they're therefore using the people they claim to be defending, and while they actually openly discriminate against them, and which is really obvious. It's been really obvious with the Asian communities for a while now. They're discriminating against them in higher education. Ted Cruz throws out an amendment, Senate amendment, what was it, 1456 or something like that. Every Democratic senator, except for like the two that didn't vote or whatever, votes to reject the prevention of intentional discrimination in colleges against Asian Americans in the middle of a Stop AAPI Hate or whatever bill, the symbolic nonsense bill that they're, I mean, it's just all just becoming more and more obvious. So I think that what we're going to see is applications of force, but every time they up the force, they shake more people out who are looking at this and saying something's badly broken. Now, what happens from that, I don't know. Your model of like a religion that's become hostile to all else, I think, is, by the way, a necessary endpoint of all of these kind of Gnostic faiths, 100%. Because there are, I mean, the simplest argument is that they have no other options. If they're producing a second reality, their so-called, absolute knowledge that's locked into their doctrine. By the way, this is the difference between philosophers and philodoxers, people who love wisdom and people who love doctrine. And when the doctrine starts to fall apart, you only have two options: abandon the doctrine or apply force. And that to make people go along with it. And what we've seen in every single one of these scientific Gnostic religions, communism, etc., every single time it's been attempted, it goes to using force. Mao said power flows out of the barrel of a gun. Lenin's like accelerate the contradictions, by which he meant starve more people and throw more people in prison and throw them to Siberia and shoot them and whatever else. You saw the acceleration of the contradictions in the Khmer Rouge. And the Khmer Rouge becomes a very interesting example, though, because finally one day people had enough, and they just kind of show. I don't know exactly the whole details of how the Khmer Rouge ended, but I was talking with a guy the other day about it who's something of an expert, and his short summary of it was eventually the Cambodian people had enough, and they just kind of showed up, and they were like, quit, and they did. And they only put like 3 or 4 of the guys on trial. Like everybody else just became a regular citizen anymore, excluded from power, and Cambodia went back to being Cambodia. Of course, decimated, but still, like a business as usual started to come back. And I think that we might find ourselves in a similar situation here in the United States, which is why I'm more optimistic than I've been in a very long time, which is I think they're going to try to apply force. But when they try to apply force, I think they're going to meet with a very large number of people, which they don't want to have to go up against, who are like, you went too far, resign, we're not going away this time. And then they're put into this terrible decision, which is roll out the tanks or back down. And if they roll out the tanks, then everybody knows what's going on. So I think they're backing themselves into a losing position. I think that it's a necessary consequence of the faith that they've adopted. Not that a second reason, by the way, is because these faiths are utterly concerned with one thing and one thing only: power. And if you're basically your deities, and I say deities on purpose because each mass line of action has its own like pagan deity. If your deity is a power dynamic, all you're thinking about is power. And so eventually normal people recognize that the ruthless application of power is psychopathic, and they will reject that. And it just becomes a question of what happens when that outright rejection of an illegitimate application of power meets that power itself. And do they go completely psychopathic and try to, bomb us or shoot us? What do? Lock us in? If they try to like COVID passport gulag us, people like the protests are probably going to be insane. At which point it's going to be, what are they going to do with it? Are they going to start mowing people down? Are they actually going to stick people in concentration camps? At which point they've got a whole new raft of problems on their hand. Their little soft coup falls apart because it becomes hard. So I don't know where things are going, but I don't think that their religion has a lot left. All of its mass lines of action are hitting serious skepticism. And that's a very gentle way of putting what they're running into now. But you are right. Yes, And the mass line of action is the key thing. You have kind of like the nucleus of the ideology, and then it has these different mass lines where it might make progress, and it just switches. This is where I've been saying for a long time that if critical race theory falls, you're going to see an acceleration of something else. And I've never been able to put my finger. Will it be the queer theory, gender theory stuff? It's going to be whatever they think is going to be most effective. Well, it turns out they're too busy riding the COVID train, and they're too excited about trying to force the climate change mass line, neither of which are sticking very well. And I think people are already fed up. Like, they already perceive that the gender sex stuff is really out there and not okay. Like, you know, teaching like kindergartners all this weird stuff, like it's not okay. People are seeing it. So I don't know where they're going to go. And in the end, it's either Cambodian retirement or retreat, or it's they have to go, you know, too heavy-handed, at which point it ain't going to be pretty, but at least it's, you know, people know what we're working with.